We're going to further explore hybriding the integration of anterior hip capsule mobility with inferior, medial, and posterior with some anterior lateral lunge progressions. We're going to continue to build on the last couple episodes in which we talked about the anterior, the lateral, and the posterior lateral anchor of the super band as a way to perform some good self-FMR kind of technique to the hip. We'll then work on progressing our way to the posterior lateral lunge and using other implements as a way to, such as upper extremity as a driver, a dowel, a wedge, and a little box to place our foot to kind of go after giving you more mobility of the hip. So, first thing that we're going to do, let's go ahead and take this super band and let's go up as high as we can up on the left groin right here. And the reason why we're going to be taking this anterior lateral lunge now rather than straight anterior is because back to our biomechanical dialogue discussion pertaining to how the pelvis is moving in relation to the femur, we've talked about how there needs to be not only rotation forward and backwards, side to side, right and left, but how the pelvis and how the femur are kind of translating kind of up and down, forward and backwards, and kind of side to side. And we've talked about how in forms of activities such as gait walking and running, and a lot of other things that we do, what's been successful for me is kind of the side to side kind of translation, which in coupling with different forms of rotation direct the right and appropriate response for giving us that good mobility from the bottom up and the top down into that hip joint capsule. We've talked about how the hip joint capsule is this great ginormous treasure box that the body relies upon to kind of store its secret weapon. Well, these next two things that we're going to go through are going after the anterior hip joint capsule, but including inferior medial, more to help drive extension in the hip, as well as abduction, as well as internal rotation, as we get to kind of some external rotation as well. So, feet are pointed forward. We're going to go right foot, anterior lateral lunge, left heel is off the ground. And what I'm going to have you do first, so the direction of your pelvis and your hips are going to be R45, 45-degree angle to the right. Left arm is going to reach overhead, sagittal plane. We'll go frontal plane. We'll go in sync, upper extremity, kind of frontal plane driver. And then we'll preset with the dowel, and we'll rotate to the left as we're translating our hips and our pelvis 45 degrees to the right. We can use that with the dowel. We can use that driving sagittal plane and frontal plane, which we're doing now. And we can drive the rotation, or as I like to combine all three. We can go and get a little more aggressive with it by placing the super band just above the knee. So in terms of that extension, if this is making sense, what we have with that inferior anchor point right here, down here, is that we're really, down here, we're really pulling this femur into extension. And by using those 3D drivers right now, we're helping this pelvis translate forward, translate further forward better, and we're using that kind of that posterior kind of overhead reach, upper extremity overhead reach to give us kind of that posterior rotation. So what we're also doing with that is frontal plane. We're getting to that position. We're taking out the slack so that we can drive in another plane. Taking out the slack so that we get some good relative internal rotation of that left hip before we explode out of it with external rotation. So what I'm going to have you do go, so dowel in the left hand, we went through kind of a combination of overhead, side bend, and rotation, anterior lateral, and just like what we did with the anterior lunge, we're going to combine the dimensions. So left arm will reach overhead, or rotate to the left, and right arm is going to reach overhead rather to the left. So I'm going after a little hybrid, a little combo of these. So with that inferior anchor, I know I didn't show you necessarily the overhead reach, the frontal plane reach, and the transverse plane reach. We're just getting a little bit more fancy with it now. So here, let's combine an overhead reach with the left arm, and right arm is going to rotate and reach to the left. Rotate and reach to the left, or my left arm will reach overhead, and my right arm is going to reach in sync overhead in the frontal plane. Further take up that slack. Let's add something to the mix in that now we're going with a little wood board underneath the foot. Let's still go with kind of my distal driver, so down just above the knee, and we're going to go that anterior lateral lunge, but we're going to go left foot up on the wooden board to take the slack up out of the system a little bit more, so to feed in from TZ1, left foot and ankle and left hip, to go over to that right hip a little more. So we're here and here, and I can feel that not only because of the wood being under my foot and the tubing being right above the knee, instantaneously I feel like that is more aggressive of a stretch to that anterior and that inferior medial kind of joint capsule. Angulation of my drive is 45-degree angles to the left. And now let's go a little frontal plane with the foot on it. And let's now go in sync transverse plane. So 45-degree angle, that anterior lateral lunge to the left. Right foot is pointing forward. If you want to get a little more sneaky with this, a little bit more kind of aggressive per se, let's add in kind of a little 12 or 14 inch box to the picture. Let's go with that anterior lateral lunge. We're going to go and angle ourselves off kind of like a lateral. Let's go a posterior lateral anchor for this. So posterior lateral anchor. So this would be a posterior anchor. This would be a lateral anchor. Split it down the middle, I have posterior lateral. So posterior lateral anchor, if we're to go up on the hip, I'd get a combination of a great kind of hip joint capsule kind of distraction, as well as I would from kind of that lateral anchor. Inferior is a little more aggressive in terms of driving that femur into abduction to go after the inferior medial hip joint capsule with the hip extension from the anterior lateral kind of left-legged lunge position. So we're going to go left anterior lateral lunge, posterior lateral anchor. We're going to go kind of penny swings or kind of reaches overhead. So let's go feet again, L45. Let's go just straight overhead first. And I'm feeling a much deeper stretch than what I was with what I previously did. And now we're going to go frontal plane. So because I took the slack out of the system by taking the ground, moving the ground up through the left lower extremity right here, I'm therefore exposing not only the left hip but also the right hip, femur and the pelvis kind of relative motion as well. So in-sync transverse plane driver. And again, my weight shift is on an angle to the left. And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to combine them. Right arm is going to rotate in sync to the right to load up the right hip into internal rotation. Left arm is going to drive in the frontal plane, all giving and creating for us more hip extension mobility, the anterior hip joint capsule, as well as inferior medial. So weight is driving through that left anterior lateral lunge, L45. Right arm is rotating to the right, left arm side bending overhead to the right, in sync. So it's important for us again to think of, with these lunges, what's rotating pertaining to the pelvis and the femur, and which way is it sliding. The example of the football and the bullet and the sniper that we had kind of talked about in terms of its ammunition. Play around with these progressions. Anterior lateral lunges to go after the anterior hip joint capsule with facilitation and help from inferior and medial. We're going with posterior anchor, we're going with lateral anchor, and posterior lateral anchor with the super band, high up on the hip joint itself, and then below, just above that knee joint itself, to help facilitate and be a little bit more aggressive with it. Remember that posterior lateral anchor is going to give us a little bit more of a distraction of the hip joint capsule, a kind of pulling apart. Think of kind of the backyard, that example we talked about in terms of things are overgrown, we're getting in there and creating space. The same thing we're using and kind of doing with that. I want you to think about using a little kind of piece of wood. I want you to think about using a step as another progression and facilitation to that, and I want you to use a dowel or make sure that upper extremity wise that we're very good and locked in terms of the dimension and what you're driving. Play around with those guys. Your anterior, your inferior, and your medial hip joint capsule will love you.